Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going deep on Spire Global.
Ticker SPIR.
Global. So we've got quite a bit to cover here.
Yeah.
Should be really interesting, I think, for investors.
Definitely a lot going on with Spire Global.
There is a lot going on.
Yeah.
The company that's gone through a lot in the last few years.
Right.
Big stock price swings.
Yeah.
And they are right in the heart of, I think, a lot of interesting trends.
Mm-hmm.
The space economy.
Yeah, definitely.
The move toward, data analytics,
Mm-hmm.
all that kind of stuff. And so we're going to cover it all today.
Absolutely.
Maybe a good place to start is with this recent news
Yeah.
about the litigation
Sure.
with Kepler. Spire had agreed to sell
Yeah.
their maritime business to Kepler
Yeah.
for a really, sizable chunk of change.
It's a big deal.
Yeah, like $241 million.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a significant amount of money for a company like Spire. And then, they ran into some issues with this deal and wound up in litigation,
Right.
which obviously threw, a big wrench into everything.
A lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, created a lot of uncertainty. But then, just last week, I guess on April 6th,
Mm-hmm.
they announced that they had reached a settlement.
They did, yeah.
And, the market seemed to think that that was pretty good news.
Oh, yeah. The stock jumped, I think, 34%.
Yeah, 34% in one day.
Yeah.
So that's a big move.
Huge.
So I guess, from your perspective,
Sure.
what were the main takeaways from this settlement with Kepler?
Yeah, so I think the biggest takeaway is really that it removes a lot of that uncertainty that was
Okay.
hanging over the company.
Right.
The sale of the maritime business. It was, a key part of their strategy.
Yeah.
And there were doubts about whether it was going to go through,
Mm-hmm.
whether they'd be able to get the money
Yeah.
that they were counting on. And this settlement kind of clears the way for that to happen.
So it kind of like removes this big question mark.
Yeah, exactly.
Right out there.
And they've got a new deadline now
Yeah.
for closing the deal April 25th.
Okay.
With a possible extension to April 30th. So, it's pretty much a done deal at this point.
Okay. So it sounds like, investors were really worried about, what was going to happen with this deal.
Yeah.
Now it seems like at least it's more or less certain that it's going to go through.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
Okay. So, assuming that it does close, they're going to get this $241 million.
Right.
What are they planning to do with that money?
Okay, so they've said that they're going to use it to eliminate their debt,
Okay.
which is pretty substantial at this point. And then they also want to invest in some growth opportunities,
Okay.
in their core business.
So it's basically like a two-pronged approach.
Yeah, exactly.
They'll shore up the balance sheet, get rid of that debt, and then use the rest of the money to invest in growth.
Exactly.
Okay. So, it sounds like,
Yeah.
on the surface at least, this settlement is a pretty positive development for Spire.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
But, obviously there's more to the story than just this one event.
Of course.
We need to look at the broader picture of, how the company's been performing,
Yeah,
what their prospects are going forward, all that kind of stuff.
right.
So maybe we can kind of take a step back now
Sure.
and look at, Spire's overall stock performance.
Okay.
How has the stock been doing over the last couple of years?
Yeah, so if we look back, a couple of years ago, the stock actually peaked in early 2022,
Okay.
trading around $29 a share.
Wow. So that's quite a bit higher than it is.
Yeah,
now.
it's come down quite a bit since then.
Okay.
It had a low of $4.95
Okay.
back in October of 2023.
And where's it trading now?
So it's been kind of bouncing around between 750
Okay.
and 850 recently.
So still, quite a bit off of those highs.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so, that's obviously a pretty significant decline.
Yeah.
From $29 down to,
Yeah.
Around $8. So what do you think were some of the main factors that contributed to that?
Okay, so there are a few things that I think were at play here.
Yeah.
First of all, Spire has been growing its revenue.
Okay.
They did about $110.5 million
Okay.
in revenue for 2024, which is up 13% from the previous year.
It was
Yeah, it's not bad, but they're still not profitable.
Okay, so they're growing, but they're not making money.
Exactly.
And that's obviously a concern for investors.
Yeah, I mean, investors want to see that,
Yeah.
that revenue growth is translating into profits.
Right.
And that hasn't really happened yet.
Okay, so that's one factor. What else?
So another issue has been their debt.
They have a pretty high level of debt, and they've had some trouble complying with their debt covenants.
Debt covenants.
Yeah, so basically those are agreements with their lenders that say, they have to maintain certain financial ratios.
Okay.
And if they don't meet those ratios, then the lenders can basically, demand their money back.
I see.
Or impose other penalties. And Spire has actually had to get waivers from their lender, Blue Torch Capital.
So they basically had to say, hey, we're not meeting the terms of our agreement.
Yeah.
Can you please cut us some slack?
Exactly.
And so that's obviously a sign that, things aren't going as well as they had hoped.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a red flag for investors.
Okay, so we've got, the lack of profitability. We've got the debt issues.
Right.
What else was there?
So there were also some accounting irregularities,
Okay.
which led to them having to restate their financials.
So that's never a good thing.
No, it's not a good look.
Yep. It makes investors question the reliability of the company's financial reporting.
Absolutely.
And then on top of all that, there was all the uncertainty surrounding the sale of the maritime business.
Right.
Before they reached this recent settlement.
Yeah.
It was a big overhang on the stock.
So basically investors were worried
Yeah.
about, whether the deal would go through, whether they would get the money, what that would mean for the company's future.
Exactly.
So it's just a lot of uncertainty, and that tends to, weigh on stock prices.
For sure. Uncertainty is not good for stock prices.
Okay, and then one last thing that I wanted to touch on is dilution.
Oh.
Spire has raised a lot of money.
They have.
From investors. They did a $40 million private placement.
Right.
Just back in March. And so can you just kind of explain, how that works and why that can be a negative for existing shareholders?
So when a company issues new shares of stock, it increases the total number of shares that are outstanding.
Okay.
And that means that each existing share represents a smaller ownership percentage of the company.
I see.
So it's kind of like, if you have a pie.
Yeah.
And you cut it into 10 slices, and then you decide to cut it into 20 slices.
Right.
Each slice is going to be smaller.
Okay, so it's basically like your slice of the pie gets smaller.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's dilution.
Yeah.
And so, while Spire needs that money to fund its operations and its growth,
right.
It does come at a cost to existing shareholders.
It does.
Okay, so we've got a lot of, factors here that help to explain why the stock prices come down so much.
Yeah, it's been a tough couple of years for Spire shareholders.
Okay, so now let's kind of shift gears a little bit.
Okay.
And talk about Spire's competitive landscape.
Right.
Who are they competing with? And how do they stack up?
Yeah, so Spire is considered a small cap company.
Okay.
Their market cap is around $231.94 million.
Okay.
Which, sounds like a lot of money.
It does.
But it's actually pretty small compared to the average company in the communication services sector, which is where Spire is often categorized. The average market cap there is $6.7 billion.
Wow.
And in the aerospace sector, which is other area that's relevant to Spire, the average market cap is even higher.
Okay.
$17.4 billion.
So they're definitely a small fish in a big pond.
Yeah, that's one way to put it.
Okay. So who are some of the specific companies that Spire is competing with?
Okay. So in the broader communication services sector, you have companies like Gray Television,
okay,
Anterix Wide Open West, EW Scripts, iHeartMedia.
Those are some big names.
They are. But it's important to note that a lot of those companies operate in different segments
right.
of the communication industry.
Yeah, like broadcasting and media.
Exactly.
Okay, so in terms of more direct competitors, companies that are actually doing satellite data and analytics, who are some of the key players there?
So some of the main players in that space are Black Sky, Planet Labs, and Maxar Technologies.
Those are all companies that we've heard of?
Yeah, they're all pretty well known in the industry.
Okay, so how does Spire kind of stack up against those companies?
Yeah, so Spire is still a relatively small player. As we said, their market cap is much smaller than those other companies, but they have been growing their revenue at a pretty impressive rate.
Okay.
One report that I saw said that their revenue was up 31.7% year over year.
Yeah.
To $105.7 million.
So they're definitely growing quickly.
Yeah, they are.
Okay. So now let's talk about valuation.
Okay.
The stock is trading around 750, 850.
Right.
How do we think about, whether that's a good price or not?
Yeah. So one way to look at valuation for a company like Spire is to use the price to sales ratio.
Okay.
Which basically compares the company's market cap to its revenue. And so based on Spire's current market cap of around $231.94 million,
okay,
and their 2024 revenue of $110.5 million, their price to sales ratio is about 2.1x.
Okay.
Which is relatively low
okay,
compared to a lot of other growth stage tech companies.
So that suggests that maybe the stock is undervalued.
Potentially. But, it's important to remember that a low price to sales ratio can also be a sign that the market is concerned about the company's profitability or its growth prospects or other risks.
So it's not always a clear-cut signal.
No, it's not.
Okay. What about Spire's future growth? What are they projecting?
So they're projecting revenue growth of 12 to 17% for 2025.
Okay.
And about 20% for 2026.
Okay.
And those projections exclude the maritime business.
Right, because that's being sold. Okay, so, assuming they can hit those targets, that would obviously be very positive for the stock.
Yeah, I mean, it would show that they're able to grow their business even without the maritime segment.
Right.
And it could potentially lead to a higher valuation.
Okay. And then what about, what are the analysts saying?
So the analysts are actually pretty bullish on Spire.
Okay.
The average price target is around $14.63.
Okay.
Which implies a pretty significant upside from the current price.
And the consensus rating is a moderate buy.
Yeah.
So that suggests that, the analysts overall think that the stock is a good investment.
Yeah, that's the general sentiment.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the management team.
Okay.
Who's running the show at Spire?
So there's been some interesting changes in the leadership team recently.
Okay.
Back in January, Teresa Condor was appointed CEO.
Okay.
She had previously been the chief operating officer, and she's been with Spire since the early days. And then Peter Platzer, who was the founder and CEO, he transitioned to the role of executive chairman.
I see.
So it's kind of a changing of the guard.
Yeah.
And I think it's a positive sign.
Okay.
Teresa Condor has a strong track record of success in the industry.
And Peter Platzer's still involved?
Yeah, he's still there to provide guidance and support.
Okay. And so what are some of the key strategic priorities for the new management team?
So they're really focused on operational efficiency.
Okay.
They want to make sure that Spire is running as smoothly and efficiently as possible.
And that makes sense given, some of the challenges that they've had.
Absolutely.
With profitability and debt and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, they need to get their house in order.
Right.
And that's what Teresa Condor is focused on doing.
Okay. And then, the sale of the maritime business is obviously a big part of that.
Yeah, definitely.
It's going to help them reduce their debt and focus on their core growth areas.
Exactly.
Okay. And then they've also, created this new space reconnaissance division.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. So this is a new area for Spire.
Yeah.
They're basically providing data and analytics to the defense and intelligence communities.
Okay. So it's kind of like a new market for them.
Yeah, exactly.
And that could be a big opportunity.
It could be huge.
Yeah.
The government spends a lot of money on intelligence and reconnaissance.
Yeah.
And Spire is well positioned to capitalize on that.
Okay. So we've talked about the Kapler settlement. We've talked about, Spire's overall stock performance, competitive landscape, valuation management team. Let's talk a little bit about their financial health.
Okay.
What does their balance sheet look like? What are some of the key risks that investors should be aware of?
Okay. So we've already talked about their debt.
Right.
Which is obviously a major concern.
Yep.
But there are some other risks as well.
Okay.
One is dilution. We talked about how Spire has raised a lot of money from investors.
Yeah.
And that has resulted in dilution for existing shareholders.
And so that's something that, investors need to keep an eye on.
Yeah, absolutely.
If Spire continues to need to raise money, that could lead to further dilution.
Yeah, and that would put downward pressure on the stock price.
Right.
Okay, so that's one risk.
Mm-hmm.
Another risk is Spire's still burning cash. They're not profitable yet. And they're still spending more money than they're bringing in.
And so that's obviously not sustainable in the long run.
No, it's not.
They need to either become profitable or raise more money. And as we just discussed, raising more money could lead to dilution.
Exactly.
So it's kind of a vicious cycle.
Yeah, it can be.
Okay, and then, we also talked about the accounting issues.
Right.
Those are obviously a concern as well.
They are.
It makes investors wonder, if they can trust the company's financial statements.
Yeah, and it can take a long time to rebuild that trust once it's been broken.
Okay, and then, even though they've reached a settlement with Kapler, there's still a risk that the deal could fall apart.
It's a small risk.
Right.
But it's still a risk.
Something could happen that could prevent the deal from closing.
Yeah.
Okay. So those are some of the key risks.
Mm-hmm.
What about the positives? What are some of the things that investors are excited about when it comes to Spire?
Okay, so one of the things that investors are really excited about is Spire's business model.
Okay.
They have this kind of unique satellites as a service model.
Okay.
Where they basically provide data and analytics to customers without those customers having to launch their own satellites.
Nice.
So it's kind of like, the software is a service model, but for space.
Okay, so it's like a subscription model.
Exactly.
Where you're paying for access to data.
Yeah.
Okay, and so that's a very scalable model.
It is.
They can add new customers without having to incur a lot of additional costs.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, and so that's one thing that investors are excited about. What else?
So another thing that investors are excited about is Spire's growth potential.
Okay.
They're operating in a very large and growing market.
Yeah.
The space economy is expected to be worth trillions of dollars.
Wow.
In the coming years.
And Spire is well positioned to capture a significant share of that market.
Yeah, they're definitely in the right place at the right time.
Okay, and then they're also developing some really interesting new technologies.
Yeah.
Like their AI-powered weather models.
Right.
And their space reconnaissance capabilities. Yeah. And so those could be big growth drivers for them in the future.
Absolutely.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about market sentiment.
Right.
What are investors thinking about Spire right now?
Yeah, so market sentiment is a tricky thing.
Yeah.
It can change very quickly based on news and events. Right.
But I would say that right now, sentiment is pretty positive.
Yeah.
The settlement with Kepler was a big boost.
Yeah.
And investors seem to be optimistic about the company's future.
Okay. And then how about the breakdown between retail investors and institutional investors?
So retail investors actually make up a pretty large percentage of Spire's shareholder base.
And that can sometimes lead to more volatility in the stock price.
Yeah, because retail investors tend to be more emotional.
Right.
They're more likely to react to news in a knee-jerk way, whereas institutional investors tend to be more level-headed.
Right.
They're more likely to take a long-term view.
Okay. And then what are some of the key takeaways from Spire's recent earnings calls?
So in their recent earnings calls, Spire has been emphasizing their growth potential.
Okay.
They've been talking a lot about their new AI-powered weather models.
Right.
And their space reconnaissance capabilities.
And they've also been talking about their plans to improve their operational efficiency.
So it sounds like they're really trying to focus on the things that investors care about.
Exactly.
Okay. So let's wrap up here.
Okay.
What are some of the key things that investors should be watching for when it comes to Spire?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing to watch for is the completion of the maritime business sale.
Okay.
That's a key catalyst for the stock.
Right.
Once that deal closes, Spire will be able to eliminate its debt and focus on its core growth areas.
And so that should be a positive for the stock price.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. What else?
So another thing to watch for is Spire's progress on its new growth initiatives. Like the AI-powered weather models and the space reconnaissance capabilities.
Yes.
If they can execute on those initiatives, that could really drive growth.
Okay. And then, lastly, I think investors should also be watching Spire's financial performance. Can they improve their profitability? Can they reduce their cash burn?
Those are key metrics that investors are going to be focused on.
Okay, well, that's all really helpful information. I think that gives our listeners a good overview of, what's going on with Spire Global. Obviously, there's a lot more that we could talk about.
Sure.
But I think this is a good starting point for investors who are interested in learning more.
Yeah, definitely a good primer.
All right, well, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
And for all of our listeners out there, be sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive, give us a like, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next episode. Until next time, happy